Hello and welcome to our Euronews Twitter Spaces. It's Tuesday, the 25th October, and 1 week from now, on the 1st of November, Denmark goes to the polls. I'm David McDougall, a journalist at Euronews in Lyon, and today I'm joined by Eben Chaka from think tank Europa in Copenhagen, and Professor Rune Stubeyer, a political scientist from the University of Aarhus. Nice to talk with of you. And Rune, my apologies, because I think we forced you to join Twitter just to have this Spaces conversation. How are you finding Twitter so far? It's a friendly place where nobody... You have to take... There we go. You have to take yourself off mute.
Yes. Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you both.
Thank you. There seems to be some troubles with my connection, but so far I'm finding it quite all right. Thank you.
Okay, it can get very intense on Twitter, so don't worry about taking Twitter breaks. But it's nice that you were able to join us here this afternoon, and more people will join as the Spaces goes on. Let's start with a big existential question, Eben. If we're looking at Denmark from elsewhere in Europe, why do these elections matter, or even do they matter? I hope they matter, otherwise, why do they matter?
Well, I think elections in Europe in general, in the European Union, always matter because, of course, you have 27 countries that have to agree on, at the moment, very different and difficult issues. And so it's just a matter of fact that whoever has an election is important because it's about renewing the mandate with the citizens. Then it's about finding out what will be the Danish position, so to speak, in the next forthcoming years. So it's always important when a EU member state has an election, and I just don't think maybe that the Danish EU policy will change very much. But it's still it's quite an interesting election, but we're going to talk about that in a while.
And we're going to talk about the EU as well. Rune, I find Danish politics quite complicated. I can't deny it. You've got two different Green parties, the Greens and the Green Left, neither of which are Green parties. And then Venstre, which means left, but it's a liberal right party. So when politics is complicated, it can often mean voters tune out. Is that the case in Denmark, or are these elections generating some buzz? Are people interested in the debates and the positions of the parties?
In general, I'd say they are. And we also have continuously a fairly high level of turnout in the mid 80% range. Goes up and down a little bit over the years, but we see no decline no trend in the decline of turnout. So yes, most voters take on the task and navigate through these many parties on the ballot, as you say. I think we have this time 14. That's not even the record. We had 16 back in 1987. Some of them do look like one another. There are larger differences between some of the others. But it's not likely, we should say, that we'll see all of them represented in Parliament. Currently, two parties are constantly polling below the 2% threshold, and two other parties are balancing, you could say, on the threshold. So they may get in, they may not clear the hurdle.
And that's one of the things in Nordic politics. You have this 2% threshold in Denmark, it's 4% in Sweden, 5% in Finland. Do you think 2% is the right level? Does it let too many smaller parties in, or is it just pitched the right way? Because we hear in the Swedish elections last month that maybe 4% is too high, some people say, and 4% could be too low for others. How do you think it works in the Danish system?
Well, at its core, that's a political question, I would say. So whether you want it to be more difficult to get into Parliament or not, it depends on where you stand politically. One of the typical arguments for having a higher threshold is that that's necessary in order to end up with a functioning parliament that can reach agreement and deliver a government to lead the country and pass legislation that's needed in order to handle this or that crisis. I think on that, if that's your standard of evaluation, there doesn't seem to be any major problem in the current Danish system, in the sense that we have a very well-functioning governing system, and we are accustomed to the parties in parliament working together and agreeing on major pieces of legislation. Vast amounts of the legislation is actually passed by rather broad majorities in parliament. So in that sense, the Danish system seems to be working, and I don't really hear any arguments, anybody saying that we should raise the threshold.
I think it's probably just political journalists who get confused by the number of parties, like me, who would like to see fewer parties in Parliament. But I do understand that there's often broad consensus between the parties in Denmark, but some of them do, only have 3 or 4 seats, which makes me wonder about how you go about building a coalition. You need many more parties to get a majority government than you would in Sweden or Finland, for example.
Yes. But I mean, we have a tradition of minority governments in Denmark. We've had that for a very long time. So it's very normal to have, it is the normal to have a minority government that then goes on a case-by-case basis to Parliament to find a backup for its legislation proposals. There is, however, I mean, we have negative parliamentarism, so you have to make sure that you don't get a majority against you in the chamber. But that is very rarely seen. So our political life we are just used to the many parties, and we're also used to minority governments, which makes the Danish parliament somewhat, you can say, maybe more influential than in countries where you have a strong majority governments.
That's a really good point. Let me move on to some of the issues now. So doing my homework around the elections, I was looking back to 2012, and that was the first episode of Borgen, the TV show, which I'm sure both of you have seen. In the opening scene, an advisor tells a journalist they don't want to talk to you because that's not a sexy topic, and all the parties are focused on immigration, which seems to be pretty much the same situation we're in now. So let's look at these issues one by one. I talked recently. Hello, I'm back. Sorry, that was entirely my fault. So we were just touching on Borgen there. It's a 12-year-old show, but it sort of portrays things that are happening even now in Denmark. I was speaking recently with Professor Marlene Vind, who both of you will know, and she was talking about how the EU just hasn't come up in debates, in polling about the issues that interest voters as they head into the election. Not even when it comes when the EU has a role to play in cost of living crisis or energy costs. Even the opt-outs, the 3 remaining Danish opt-outs, which is something that previous Social Democrat prime ministers have at least wanted to tackle, are not really being discussed now either. So I was curious, first of all, from Eben, why you think the European Union hasn't had a more prominent role in the discussions as a topic for what voters are interested in, or the politicians are interested in, for that matter.
Well, certainly Europe's challenges, war in Ukraine, inflation, energy prices, all of that is the sort of the backdrop of this election. And I think that's also why you see in the polls that especially the current Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen from the Social Democrats, and then the surprise of this election, the former Prime Minister, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, who has created his new party, I think that's why they are so much ahead in the polls. One of the reasons is that people understand, the Danes understand that what's going on in this world is really serious. But it is true that we don't have any real discussion on foreign affairs and European policy. And I think that's because we have a tradition in Denmark for handling EU issues sort of on the side. It takes place every week in the European Affairs Committee in Parliament, and it's usually gathered around a consensus between the center of politics, so the middle of the political spectrum, so to speak. And that's a different majority from what you normally see backing up the government. So the European politics has somewhat of a special status in Danish politics, and it's a different consensus from the general majority. And I think that's one of the reasons why we don't see it as a topic. It's also because it seems further away from the citizens, and we have, plenty of day-by-day issues that voters are much more interested in. I mean, as the energy prices and inflation and climate change and all of these things that are on top of voters' minds, the Danish NHS and so on. Yes, sorry.
But some of the issues, whether it's foreign and security policy when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, the energy crisis, the cost of living crisis, the climate crisis, so many crises, those are all being tackled at a European level, at a sort of supranational level when it comes to Denmark. And so other countries have been very plugged in to wanting to find those solutions at a European level. Is there, I mean, maybe that's one of the reasons it doesn't feature so much in the campaign, the EU, simply because it's infused into so many other aspects of everyday policy.
Well, I think it's also because the major parties don't have any problem with there being a sort of a European consensus on a day-to-day basis. I don't think that they need to politicize the EU in the domestic debate. They kind of want to keep that for sort of what we are dealing with after the elections. And there is no big disagreement between a lot of the parties when it comes to how to tackle all these crises on the international level, on the EU level. And we kind of saw the same thing, in the recent Swedish elections. They were faced with the same problems of, inflation, energy prices, all of that. And it still was not a topic. It was much more of a topic in international newspapers than it was a topic back in Sweden and in their national election. So it's kind of like we kind of forget that all these issues we're dealing with in the campaign has a European leg also, so to speak. We don't want to, or the major parties don't see any interest in discussing this. And
it's very refreshing as somebody from Britain to hear you talk about how the European Union is not politicized and used as a weapon against one side or the other. That would have been very refreshing back in 2016, I suspect, in Britain. But here we are, a different time, different paths taken. What do you then, Asruni? Do you think, I was looking at one of those opinion polls that came out on TV2, where it was the self-selecting ones, where people are asked to pick two topics that really matter to them in this election. And it's issues, as you would imagine, that matter personally to people. So the economy, healthcare, education, those kind of things. Are politicians talking about the same issues on the campaign trail that matter to the voters? Or is there any kind of disconnect there? I'm thinking in particular, we're going to transition on to talking about immigration. I'm thinking about that. Immigration fell fairly far down the list of issues that matter to voters, and yet it seems to dominate political discussion.
That picture I don't recognize, I should say. The immigration debate is far from as extensive this time around as it has been on previous elections. I'd say it's clearly fallen down the list of what politicians are talking about as well. And indeed, I'd say that the dominant topics that's the healthcare system, it's the energy crisis, the inflation problem, that's taking the lead. Then also the question of what form of government should we end up having after the election. So I don't think immigration plays that much of a role, at least on the surface now. But if I may just add one comment to the discussion about EU being absent as a topic in Danish politics, I'd say that's completely standard. I'd have been surprised had it been otherwise, because it never plays any major role in national elections. And in addition to the points that Eben raised, I would say that we also have a tradition of handling EU business through referenda. So as you will know, we have a long history of deciding Danish relations with the EU in referenda. And because we have this, then it's sort of that's also a factor that contributes to take it out of everyday politics. And in addition to there being a consensus among the main parties in parliament about the Danish position on most of these issues, there is also the problem that for many of these larger parties, they are actually facing a split electorate on the EU issues. So if they were to politicize it and bring it up in the parliamentary campaign like this one, they might actually risk losing votes on that count. So that's also a factor that contributes to keeping it off the agenda.
And may I just jump in here, because I completely agree with Rune. You can never win votes in Denmark on European issue or the European Union. Just another thing on migration that I think is very interesting. Denmark is known abroad for having been sort of very anti-immigration for many years. And I, in this campaign, actually see a little bit of change on that issue. There's more or less a built consensus of having a strict migration policy in Denmark. And that's like one of the reasons why the Social Democrats won the last election. But now I see some parties, including this party of the former Prime Minister, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, who's talking about relaxing some of what he calls root out the weeds in the migration policy that Denmark has, sort of trying to relax a little bit the rules. And that's new. It doesn't have, the migration issue doesn't seem to have the same power in this election that it has had in the previous ones. And that was just an add-on to what Rune said about migration.
Yeah, and I think that's probably what the rest of Europe, as you said, what Denmark is very known for is being quite strict on immigration. And so that's one of the issues that the rest of Europe looks to see how Denmark is handling. We're going to pick up some of those points just now, but if you're just joining us, welcome to the conversation. You're listening to Euronews Twitter Spaces about the Danish election, which is coming up a week from now on the 1st of November. I'm David McDougall, a journalist at Euronews in Lyon, and today I'm joined by our guests, Ibn Shaka from think tank Europa in Copenhagen, and Rune Støberg, a political scientist at the University of Aarhus. And I say that voting starts next Tuesday. It's already started because it's advanced voting. And if you're in the Faroe Islands, you will be casting your ballots on Monday, the 31st instead. That's because there's a local holiday, I'm reliably informed, in the Faroe Islands on Tuesday. So voting is already underway. Rune, do we get any idea of how people vote in advance? Or there's, in some countries, you get some data on advanced polling, and other countries it's just left up till election night. How does it work in Denmark?
The only info we get before election night is the number of early votes, and the story on that is that it seems to be lagging a little bit behind what we saw in 2019. But we should bear in mind that last week was a school holiday, so potentially a lot of voters have been away from their homes and away from thinking about politics. So I wouldn't place too much emphasis on that. But that's all we get. We don't know how people voted among the early voters.
And what sort of numbers are we talking about? In Finland, up to a third of people cast their votes in general elections in advance of polling day. What kind of figures are there in Denmark usually?
Much lower. We've seen an increase, so that now the level is around, I think, between 8 and 9%, a little bit higher in the cities and lower in the countryside, but that's about it.
So let me turn back a little bit to migration. And when I spoke earlier, even to one of your colleagues at think tank Europa, she was struck, it was just after the elections had been announced, had been the first party leader debate, and she was struck by how much consensus there was around this Rwanda plan, which has been in the works for several years now. And some people listening might find it odd that a social democrat, a left-wing prime minister like Mette Frederiksen, would support a plan to outsource asylum seekers to Rwanda, a scheme that's caused so much outcry in the United Kingdom that it's sort of not happened in the end. It seems quite a right-wing tactic. Has immigration as a topic in general dragged Danish politics a little bit further to the right, some of these centre or left-wing parties? Or is there just consensus around this as a subject?
I think definitely that migration has turned Denmark's left-wing parties towards the right, in a general terms of speaking. I think the Rwanda issue is kind of interesting in the sense that it's been talked a lot about, but as in Britain, it has not been realized yet. There's been talk about this for many years now, and we still haven't sort of finalized the process. It's out there so that voters can see it, but I'm not sure it's ever going to happen. And that's also why you see some Danish parties talking about that they would only go into a vote against the government if this actually happens, because there's a lot of talk about whether this is actually legally possible for Denmark to do that within also the EU obligation that Denmark has. So for me to see, it's the way for the Social Democrat to neutralize this discussion on migration in Denmark, and not really sort of a viable long-term option, even though they also phrase it as a model for Europe. But I haven't heard anyone else in Europe talking about it being a model.
No, quite the opposite. In some other countries, it's seen as not a model of how to do things. And I did get to pose that question to the Minister of Immigration and Integration in Denmark about the legality of it, and I got a very a bland politician's response to it when I asked. So there certainly seemed to be a lot of unanswered questions around the scheme. And as you said, it's not there yet. The groundwork has been laid for the legislation. There's a deal with Rwanda to look at the issues, but no actual deal, with a financial amount attached to it in the works just quite yet. And yeah, as you say, it might be enough just for parties to say that they're for it, so that they don't look soft. But very interesting to hear that there might be some softening of position from the former Prime Minister Rasmussen, as you said. Let me ask just a little bit in the looking forward to the next week. We've had one former prime minister campaigning for a sort of government of national unity before. That was his idea at the last election. At that time, Mette Frederiksen said she was against it, but now she's made, overtures about saying that it could be the way forward for Denmark. What do you think is her strategy, Rune, behind that idea? Because as you both explained, Denmark has this long tradition of minority government. She herself was in a minority government with a sort of confidence and supply deals, which was her undoing in the end, I suppose, because when parties withdraw their support, then she had no option but to kind of be forced into calling this election 7 months early. But what do you think her strategy is for looking at a more broad government for Denmark? Is it a vote-winning concept, or is it something that's needed to get over current problems, cost of living crisis, energy crisis, all those things?
Well, I guess there's two answers to that. One is that is her genuine position. She really wants this broad government with also parties from the traditional blue bloc. And I'm in no position to say that that's not the case. But of course, we can also look at a different, more strategic answer, and that would be that it's also a way to broaden her possibilities for securing her own position after the election. Because as you did mention, one of the current support parties has is causing some trouble for the government, that is the Radikale Venstre, or Social Liberal Party, who were the ones demanding the election to be held now, and who are also saying that they are not supporting a government that even wants to continue with this Rwanda plan. So if they were to be needed for a social democratic government to remain in power, then they would have a problem. But by opening up the possibility of then a broader government, then she may, she secures for herself some more wiggle room, you could say, some more room for negotiating after the election. And I should say that the argument that such a government is needed in order to tackle the very many crises facing all countries in Europe, including Denmark, that argument is not very strong because, as Eben explained early on, we have this very strong tradition of broad government, broad coalitions, legislative coalitions in Parliament, and they seem to be able to come together and solve problems as they come up. The Prime Minister has mentioned as the model for what she wants after the election, the type of government she wants. She's mentioned the so-called national compromise among the major centrist parties about increasing the defense budget to comply with the 2% requirement from NATO. A deal struck, I think, back in March. And that is as good an example as you can get of how the system really works in terms of securing broad consensus about important pieces of legislation, even without there being a broad government. I mean, the system works even without the government. So that particular argument, I don't think is very convincing.
So if the system works without having a broad spectrum government, then why is Frederiksen and others so in favour of it now? Like, what's in it for her? And that's the cynic in me that asks what's in it for her, because I'm cynical about all politicians, as we should all be. By the way, we should all be cynical about their motives. But
well,
yeah.
I mean, there's a very simple explanation, and that is the voters like it. They like, to see a government sort of across the blocks, because we've been living with these blocks for the past 20 some years in Denmark. So that's a simple explanation. I just want to touch upon why I don't think it's that realistic that we'll get a government sort of across from left to right. And it's basically, I don't think they will be able to agree on who should be the prime minister and what kind of program they would actually produce. I simply don't think that they can agree on that. So I don't really believe it's a realistic option.
And I was going to ask about some predictions for after the election. Rooney, would you care to look into a crystal ball and tell us how you think things will shake out?
I'm afraid it's a very, very foggy crystal ball that I have on my table in that respect, because it's a completely open and very unpredictable game that we're looking into, I'd say. Of course, depending on the election outcome, it seems in the polls now that the two main options is either a straight out majority for the red bloc, which would then lead to negotiations about forming some form of government with the Social Democrats at the helm. But as I mentioned, the Social Liberals are, at least in advance, causing some trouble for those negotiations. The other option seems to be a situation where Lars Løkke Rasmussen and his party, the Moderates, will be the pivotal party. And so he, in effect, will be a kingmaker. And he, as you know, is sort of the father of the idea of the broad government that he launched back in 2019. And so my expectation is that he'll be pushing really hard for this to happen. And that will then take several rounds of government negotiations where they will then try to wear each other down potentially in terms of securing such a deal. But I agree with Eben that I don't see such a government being formed. I don't think the right-wing parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, will have any real incentive to form part of such a government. And then we'll see. Some will say that rather than having Mette Frederiksen continue as Prime Minister, the Conservatives and Liberal will then offer the position to Lars Løkke Rasmussen for a third time. And that might be one possibility, only that would lead to him losing his edge, in the sense that he will then potentially be seen as, well, okay, so this is just another right bloc government that he will then be heading if they will be the party supporting it. But of course, there's other problems involved in those negotiations as well. So I think all that one can basically say now is that it looks really interesting, but also it looks like something that may take quite a while.
But Rooney, as a political scientist, don't pretend that you are not really looking forward to weeks of political intrigue around trying to form a new government. That's what you guys live for.
I'm more interested in the voter side, I should say. So now is my heyday, if you will. Also because government negotiations often will take place behind more or less closed doors. So we'll only see intermittent stories and leaks and stuff like that normally. But yes, of course, it will be extremely interesting.
And even if I let you have the last word, what are your crystal ball predictions, perhaps, for what happens after next Tuesday?
Well, I agree with Rune. I think we're going to look at very lengthy negotiations, because what we've seen the past couple of weeks is an extremely volatile electorate. That, you know, people have been changing their vote from one party to another. So right now it's completely unpredictable what will happen. So I think we will go into lengthy negotiations. I think, well, it will maybe take weeks before we have a new government. I don't think that there will be a lot of consequences for how Denmark will act on the European level. I don't see any significant change there. It's going to be still very much the position that Denmark is known for, sort of tight on fiscal expenditure, with Germany a long step of the way, and very much active in anything that has to do with green transition. So that I don't think will change once we have the new government.
And I liked right there an example with our two guests of Danish political consensus. Thank you for listening today to our conversation. I want to thank Iben Shaka and Rune Stubayer, and our producer behind the scenes making sure everything works, James Thomas. Although when things go wrong, it was me. I was pressing the wrong part of the screen. And of course, you can find our full coverage, of the Danish election campaign on our website, euronews.com. And this recording will be available there as well for you to listen back. Thanks again. Bye for now.
Thanks for having us. Bye.
Bye.